Um, as I was setting up in here, I heard somebody say, and I'm not sure who she was, but I think it was Mary Lautinen. Um, no, I heard somebody say, I like this presenter, but I'm kind of sick of Andrew Jackson. And I had to say, unfortunately, we have two more left of this guy. Because Andrew Jackson, his two great achievements were, number one, removing Native Americans from Georgia and Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, part of North Carolina, west of the Mississippi River to a place called Indian Territory. We now call it Oklahoma. That is called the Trail of Tears. About 100,000 Native Americans from the so-called five civilized tribes, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek, the Cherokee, and the Seminole, were all removed in the 1830s to Oklahoma. That was a disaster. The second achievement, but he considered it an achievement. The second achievement was also a disaster, and that's the one I'm going to talk about tonight. I'm going to save Indian removal for next time, next month, but I'm going to talk about Andrew Jackson's destruction of our national banking system, which he did deliberately by abolishing essentially the institution that presided over our banking system, the Second Bank of the United States. And by the end of the talk, I think you will agree that it is richly ironic that Andrew Jackson should be on the $20 bill. Because Andrew Jackson disapproved very strongly of paper money. And he also waged war and killed the predecessor to the Federal Reserve. And our bills are actually Federal Reserve notes. It is our central bank. He eradicated our central bank, and it really remained a problem in the national economy until the 20th century, until the Federal Reserve was created. And that's the story I'm going to tell tonight, because it really is an interesting one. The Bank of the United States was created as the brainchild of our brilliant Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, who created it in 1791 to be our central bank. It would hold all government funds. It would pay all government bills. It would lend money to businesses and institutions and companies, individuals, and other banks. It would be the bank of last resort, the banker's bank. It would be our central bank. And he created it in 1791. It had a 20-year charter. It was rechartered, and Andrew Jackson refused or vetoed the recharter to have it go another 20 years. Andrew Jackson opposed the Bank of the United States. He thought it was an elitist, aristocratic institution, and that it had to be abolished. He considered it the monster. He called it the monster. And he did succeed in killing it. It is quite by vetoing its charter. The first veto in American history, by the way. The first important veto. So that's part of the story, the drama of the story. And Andrew Jackson's veto of the Second Bank of the United States charter was really a culmination of a long and tumultuous history of American money in early America. Money was a problem in the United States until the 20th century. Truly, money was some Europeans said, nobody talks more about money than Americans. And nobody has a harder time defining what it is. Because we never really had much currency here, even in the colonial period. British North America didn't have gold or silver. Britain didn't have gold or silver. And so Americans used all kinds of things to pass as money. They used tobacco ropes. That was legal tender. A knot of tobacco was legal tender in Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Maryland. Legal tender means If somebody offers it to you for payment, you must accept it. It's not an option. This represents legal tender. People used nails in New England. Anything that could hold value that wouldn't depreciate. Beaver pelts. Wampum was especially valued. That was used for decades. Wampum was Native American currency, and it was made, they were fine beads that were strung into strings or into a belt like that. The channel whelks were used for the white, I believe, and large shell clams shells were used for the purple. And this was very stable, excellent currency. And it was legal tender in Massachusetts until about 1700, at which time the Dutch started counterfeiting it. It's always the Dutch. They dyed some kind of shells. They found a berry that could dye the bright purple, and that depreciated the wampum, and so people moved on to other things. By far the most valued currency easily until the Civil War, even after the Civil War, and it was legal tender, was the Spanish pieces of 8, the peso de ocho, or the Spanish real. It was a 1-ounce silver coin, the first national currency. The silver was mined in South America. It circulated throughout North America and throughout the world. It really was the first, I should say, international or global currency. It had value everywhere. It was extremely well minted. It invented these ridges that are put in the edges so that you can't carve off little pieces of silver, the milled edge there. It worth about $300 in today's money, and because of that, it was often used. People would cut it to give it as change because it was so valuable. It would be cut into a maximum of 8 pieces, and 1/8 of a peso de ocho was called a bit. So 2 bits was a quarter. And that's where we get a lot of our language about money from this early mayhem in currency. 2 bits, shelling it out, clams for dollars, an old rhetorical term. We also get our symbol for the dollar from the peso de ocho. The ribbon wrapped around here, this pillar on the Spanish peso de ocho, is where we get a lot of our symbolism. The word dollar itself comes from Joachim Thaler, a silver mine in Bohemia. Dollar is a bastardization of the German Thaler, or Taler, for valley. So it's this slang of this early currency, this early money came from. And of course, by the early 18th century, the early 19th century, there's a lot of paper money floating around and a lot of banks issuing paper money. Once the Bank of the United States was created and the bank started minting gold and silver coins, those coins were legal tender, and they would be purchased by a bank, and then the bank would lend banknotes based on the reserves of minted coinage that they had in their vaults. So the idea is you would pick up a banknote like this from the Mechanics Bank in Pittsburgh, and you would use it to buy things, and then whenever you wanted, you could go theoretically, that the whole idea was you could take that banknote to the Mechanics Bank and exchange it for $1 in gold. And they had to have it. They had to give it to you. It was exchangeable. This was the most common way to pay for anything in the early 19th century. And there were thousands and thousands of different banknotes circulating. There were 8,000 small banks in the United States in the early 19th century, each one of them with its own banknote. Thousands upon thousands. I mean, you would see something different almost every day. and you'd have to figure out where it came from and what it was. It was really confusing. And not all of it were banks. There were businesses, too, that issued their own notes. This is an old one from 1777. This is a tobacco note. In the South, there weren't as many banks, but there were a lot of tobacco warehouses. And they issued their own notes based on tobacco reserves. So this would circulate as currency here. This guy, James Allen, had 561 pounds of tobacco. He could redeem this for the tobacco itself, or he could buy things with it, kind of like an IOU. That's how banknotes worked. And it wasn't just banks, as I said, tobacco warehouses, bridge companies, railroads, iron forges. I mean, you name it. The towns and cities had their own, states had their own currency, and it all circulated together. It's very hard, and they had all kinds of, different images on them. They weren't, there was only one, by far, the most popular image on a banknote in the 19th century was Santa Claus. By far. Probably 1 out of every 10 banknotes had Santa Claus on it. It's amazing how many. Here's a Santa Claus note. Here's another one. This bank even named itself after Santa Claus. Let's just cut to the chase, And the idea was this: what a bank wanted to issue the note, and they never wanted to see that note again. Because if that note was returned to them, they would have to give up some gold or silver. So the idea was create very valued looking banknotes that people would give as gifts and that people would value so much. Often the best printing in America was on banknotes. The most expensive paper, the most colorful printing, the finest art reproductions were on banknotes, because banks were highly incentivized never to see the banknote again. So that's why Santa Claus, they were given out as gifts at Christmas, and banks didn't. Can you imagine living in a world where you've dealt with all this different kinds of currency? I mean, imagine being like a tavern keeper in Pittsburgh, and you have 2 people who come in, and they buy 5 glasses of Pennsylvania rye whiskey, and they go to pay for it, and one of them gives you a $3 note from the Mechanics Bank, right down the street in Pittsburgh, the Mechanics Bank of Pittsburgh. The other one gives you a $3 note from the Drovers Bank in Salt Lake City. The first thing you're going to do is ask, where's Salt Lake City? And how are you going to check that this is really a going concern? I mean, you're never going to travel to Salt Lake City. There's nobody you could call. There's no way to check up. And so what you end up doing as a tavern keeper is you kind of on your feet, you discount the note. That's what it was called, discounting. You say, we're in Pittsburgh, this is Salt Lake City note. I'll give you $1 for it. It'll be worth $1. And that was how it worked. And this was a constant irritation to buyers and sellers in early America, and it's treated often or made reference to in literature. Herman Melville makes reference to it. It's hard for modern readers to understand when they see the reference. There's this little book about it called The History of the Little Frenchman and His Banknotes. It's a thin little book, 1815, and it's a funny story about this, rather sophisticated Frenchman where they have a common currency. And he comes to the United States for the first time. He lands in Charleston. And he starts buying things. He gets Charleston banknotes, and he starts buying things. And he starts to notice that he's getting change in different kinds of notes. And then when he goes to use those notes to pay for things, they're worth less than the face value. And it dawns on him, he's being ripped off every single purchase. Everything he's buying, these shopkeepers know an easy mark, and they're giving him their worthless notes. And so he catches on as he travels. He travels up to Boston. And he has a bunch of Boston banknotes. And he notices that the closer he gets to Boston, those banknotes are worth more. Until when he finally gets to Boston, they're worth face value. And he runs into somebody in a tavern who explains, yeah, there's a whole business around speculating in these notes. You know, you buy Boston banknotes in Charleston, then you travel to Boston and you sell them where they're worth something. So a $5 note is not worth $5 everywhere. It's worth, some places it's worth $1, some places it is worth $5. It was almost impossible to keep up with the variety and diversity of banknotes that circulated. If you wanted to, you could subscribe to this, Thompson's Banknote Reporter. Came out every month, and it would give you it rated every banknote known in circulation and give you a quick little rating. So you would keep it under the bar, and you would consult with it when somebody gave you an unfamiliar banknote. So this is one I just pulled off Google Images here, Google Books. I found a issue of the Banknote Reporter from 1851, and you can see here it says, the Georgia Lumber Company in Portland, Maine. This concern has been recently resuscitated. We have no confidence in its safety. In other words, deeply discount this note. If somebody tries to pass this note on to you, deeply discount it. So this currency issue was just vexing in American history, as I said, well, really into the 20th century. And Andrew Jackson himself got caught up in it in a bad, bad way. Jackson, as you know, was a land speculator, also traded in slaves, and a liquor store owner. And he bought 50,000 acres of land in western Tennessee. 50,000 acres for 10 cents an acre. And it was so cheap because Native Americans were living there, it wasn't safe to live on, but the hope was that someday it would appreciate, he'd be able to sell it. He decided that he was going to make the 700-mile journey from Nashville to Philadelphia and sell it in Philadelphia. I just want to remind you, Nashville in 1795 had a population of probably 700 people. About 300 enslaved people and 300 free people. And it had a population, I just recently read this and I was perplexed by it. Somebody made a joke, Nashville has 700 people and 7,000 dogs. And I thought, I don't get that. And so I dug into that, what that joke was referring to, and it was referring to the prominence of Indian attacks. That every household had many dogs to protect the houses from and warn the residents of Native American attacks. So this is really, I'm saying all this to really emphasize how much on the front. Andrew Jackson was a man of the frontier. He truly lived on the edge of European culture. And he decided he was going to travel all the way to the center of European culture in America, the biggest city in the country, a city of 30,000 people, in 1795, to sell this 10,000 or 50,000 acres. He's going to sell it. He bought it at 10 cents an acre. He's going to sell it for 20 cents an acre to a man named David Allison, and David Allison bought it. David Allison then used 3 IOUs, 3 notes, personal notes, to pay for the acreage. And Andrew Jackson ended up making $5,000 on the deal. He took the 3 notes, and then immediately his whole ambition was to open up a trading post on the Cumberland River in Tennessee. And a trading post is mostly a liquor store that also sold tools and anything else that anybody settling in the West might need. And so he immediately turned around and bought a bunch of supplies and bought a piece of land for the trading post, set up the trading post, started selling things. And within 2 months of being in business, the man he bought the supplies from showed up and said, "Hey buddy, you passed off these bad notes. This man, David Allison, is in debtor's prison. He's bankrupt. And Jackson said, and this all went to court, as you could imagine. Jackson said, you know, that's your problem, not mine. And the guy said, no, the judge said, no, Jackson, it's your problem because you signed the backs. That was the practice. If you got an IOU from somebody and you signed the back, that was now your IOU. So he signed the back when he bought these supplies. He was responsible for it. He had to sell his trading post. He had to sell all the supplies. He got paper banknotes for it, and they were worthless. He was deep in debt, and he did not work his way out of that debt until after the Battle of New Orleans in 1815. It took him 20 years to climb. He had to sell land. He had to sell enslaved people. It took him a long time, and it left a deep, deep bitterness in him against banks, against credit, against debt, against paper money, and against the Bank of the United States, which he saw as presiding over all of this. And in attacking the second Bank of the United States, Andrew Jackson was attacking, I think, he was barking up the wrong tree. He was attacking the wrong enemy. The Bank of the United States was designed to prevent that kind of disaster. The Bank of the United States had a stabilizing influence on the currency and the economy. This is the second Bank of the United States on Chestnut Street in Philadelphia. It's now an art gallery. I was looking for its location on Google Maps, and this is a joke that I think only I could find funny. Here is the Google map images of the second bank, of this location, and it listed, Google Images listed, Second Bank of the United States, closed. Yeah, it was closed in, 1836. So that's the location there. The Second Bank of the United States was a conservative, stable institution. It was, keep in mind, and I should have emphasized this, it was a private corporation. This was not a public agency. This was not a government agency. This is a private corporation with 4,000 stockholders, half of whom were British, and a board of directors. They paid dividends to the stockholders and made the stockholders a lot of money. But it also had this important, critical public function. It was the only company in America to operate in every state. It was by far the largest corporation in the country. It was Exxon and Walmart combined. Nothing even close to being this big. It was conservative in its lending. It would only lend money to good risks, to established businesses, well-established farmers, and well-established banks. It always kept a large pool of reserves in its vaults in case people wanted to return the notes. Its banknotes were legal tender, as good as gold. You could always depend. If you returned a Second Bank of the United States banknote to the bank, you would absolutely get your gold in return. There was never a risk about that. And this is probably the most important part of the function of the Bank of the United States. It kept other banks in line. About 40% of all currency in the country was Bank of the United States banknotes. 40%. That was enough to have a big impact on the currency and the economy. That meant that it really did control inflation rates, interest rates. It was the big dog in the country. And it also lent money to other banks and bought up banknotes from other banks. And it would spot check those banks. So let's say that it bought $10,000 worth of banknotes from the Mechanics Bank of Pittsburgh. And then it caught a rumor that some trouble was happening at the Mechanics Bank of Pittsburgh. It would take those 10,000 notes, bring them to the bank, and ask that it be paid in specie or gold. Specie was a word for coin, gold coinage. And if Mechanics Bank could not pay up the gold, it went out of business. And the Bank of the United States did that. It wiped out other banks that weren't doing well. It kept the system healthy by eliminating the poor performing banks. It was the big brother. All these little banks were always looking over their shoulder, always worried that they were going to be audited, essentially, by the second Bank of the United States. So it had this important public function in kind of keeping, in avoiding the boom and bust that had characterized the American economy before the first Bank of the United States, and keeping a kind of a slow, steady path of growth for the economy in the first half of the 19th century. It played that critical role. None of this mattered to Andrew Jackson. Jackson was vehemently opposed to it. And he had two reasons for being opposed to it. One, I think, was legitimate and one was not. His opposition to it, on the one hand, was that it was unconstitutional. He would have had a point 20 years earlier. This was an issue 20 years before. This came to the Supreme Court, this kind of thing. What Andrew Jackson said is, the Constitution says nothing about creating banks. The Constitution doesn't mention that Congress has the power to create a bank or anything else like this. And Andrew Jackson was a strict constructionist. You have to read the Constitution narrowly and strictly. If it's not explicitly permitted in the Constitution, it shouldn't happen. So this went to the Supreme Court under John Marshall in 1815, 13, and Marshall ended up ruling, and the Supreme Court ended up ruling that, the Constitution doesn't explicitly say that Congress has the power to create a bank, but the power to create a bank is an implied power in the Constitution. You got to read between the lines. It's kind of a reach. But the idea is Congress is given the power to kind of look over the well-being of the society, and if creating a bank is part of that mission to have a well-functioning economy, then Congress has to have that power. That's what the Supreme Court decided. That was settled law by the 1830s, but Jackson still couldn't stand it. And so he made the argument that would not have held up in court, in the Supreme Court, that the Second Bank of the United States was unconstitutional. His second argument was that the Bank of the United States was undemocratic, and man, was he right. He was absolutely right. I mean, it was very much an undemocratic institution. As I said, this was a corporation essentially owned by 4,000 very wealthy people. 2,000 of them were living in Britain, 2,000 of them were living on the East Coast, and they were the wealthiest people in Boston and Philadelphia and New York. This was a narrow, moneyed elite who controlled the nation's money supply and controlled the nation's economy in such a way that they were able to use government funds. These are government funds that these private investors are playing with to choose which businesses are going to succeed and which will be starved of credit. They're able to choose. They could choose their friends. They could lend government money to their friends and have their friends, which they did all the time, and have their friends launch businesses or grow their businesses and then profit off of this infusion of capital that came from the federal government. He said this is patently unfair. There's no way this could be fair. This is using the levers of government to enrich the rich and to exclude the poor. It's clearly dividing the nation. He was And when you look at it that way, he's absolutely correct, you know? And Jackson looked past this important public function that in fact the bank did play in the economy that did benefit everybody, but some people benefited more than others. I think Jackson, I think Jackson would not have waged war on the bank under normal circumstances. I think Jackson was wise enough to know that, yeah, he hated the bank. Yes, it was unfair. Yes, it was undemocratic. But he was smart enough to know this institution is crucial to the economy. We get rid of the bank, the economy will collapse. I think he was smart enough to know that. And I think under normal circumstances, he would have sought not to abolish the bank, but to do the common sense things that should have been done. Some accountability, some oversight, some rules so that you couldn't lend to your friends, anti-discrimination laws, all kinds of regulations that you could impose on this monster that will take the harsh edges off of it and make it more democratic while still preserving that public function. I think he would have gone that reforming route if not for the president of the Second Bank of the United States, whom he hated. This guy, Nicholas Biddle, oh man, he was just everything Andrew Jackson hated in the world. He was the anti-Jackson. He came from a very wealthy, prominent Philadelphia family. He was a child prodigy, given a great education. He enrolled at the University of Pennsylvania at age 10, graduated at age 13, received his master's at age 15, and at age 18, he was an assistant to essentially a diplomat in Great Britain. And he traveled Europe. He would attend in his spare time the lectures at Oxford and Cambridge, in ancient Greece and Rome, these histories of ancient Greece. And I hated students like this. He would point out how much the professor got it wrong. You always had somebody like that, And he was one of those. He would correct the professor because he read ancient Greek and he understood it. He became an attorney studying the law in 30 days. The only reason he got into banking was because rather late in life, at age 30 or so, he realized he really knew nothing about finance. And so he read up on banking and finance and pretty soon became, second to Alexander Hamilton, the most brilliant financier that the country had ever seen. And he worked his way up at a very young age. Again, I think he was 35 or so. He was president of the Bank of the United States. And he ran the bank beautifully. He ran it just as it was supposed to be run. He ran it the way Alexander Hamilton had envisioned it. And it really, he helped to promote, and the bank helped to promote, this steady economic growth in the early 19th century. But Nicholas Biddle had two flaws, don't they always? He was incredibly arrogant. Insufferably arrogant. And number two, he was impolitic. He said what he thought. Who does that? He was truly anti-democratic. He thought democracy was a terrible system of government, and he said it out loud at the very time that the nation was becoming a democracy. He really said pretty much to ordinary people are not smart enough to understand the Bank of the United States and should just butt out of our business. Let us run it. We'll let you know what we need. And he would say this to Congress. I don't want to waste my time explaining how the system works. He said, these are examples of things that he said in public. There are very few banks which would not be destroyed by the exertion of powers of the Bank of the United States. He said that in testimony in Congress. In other words, he could destroy any bank he wanted. This was too much power. He said to a bank manager, no officer of the government from the president downwards has the least right, the least authority, the least pretense for interference in the concerns of this bank. The officers of the Bank of the United States should regard only the instructions of those who govern it and should at all times be prepared to execute the orders of the board in direct opposition, if need be, to the wishes of the president and every officer of the government. And then finally he said, I have been for years in the daily exercise of more personal authority than any president habitually enjoys. He was bragging about how powerful he was. This is an unelected private businessman who controls the economy. And in November 1829, Nicholas Biddle was arrogant and impolitic enough to request a personal audience with the president. And they sat down, and Nicholas Biddle said this in 1829. He said, the Second Bank of the United States is up for a recharter in 1836. I propose to you that you recharter the bank early in next year, in 1830. That will create a great surge in value in the stock price, and our stockholders will benefit from the increase in value. And in return for doing this, I will pay off the national debt for you, which is something that you want to achieve. Could you imagine making this proposition to Andrew Jackson? I mean, Nicholas Biddle was lucky to get out of the White House with his life, you know? I'm surprised Jackson didn't beat him to death with his cane. I mean, this was exactly, here was Biddle coming to, caught red-handed, to confess to what Jackson considered a crime, you know? This is bribery. This is exactly the kind of insider dealing, you know, corruption that had characterized the government and especially the aristocratic, you know, East Coast elite for generations. And here was Biddle coming in and, you know, confessing and proposing this ridiculous, awful exchange. So Jackson threw him out of the White House, and Nicholas Biddle went to the Speaker of the Senate leader, Henry Clay. Henry Clay was now the leader of a new political party called the Whig Party, W-H-I-G. They were a political party that existed for one reason only, to get rid of Andrew Jackson. They didn't agree on anything else, but they knew they hated Jackson. Henry Clay from Kentucky, he was going to run against Jackson in 1832, and so Nicholas Biddle proposed to Clay, why don't we set up a trap for Jackson? Why don't you, Clay, introduce in the Senate and have introduced in the House a bill to recharter the bank early with expanded powers. Make it even bigger and more powerful. Jackson, both houses will pass it because the economy's been doing so well, the bank functions so beautifully. Everybody agrees that, you know, having a stable bank benefits the economy, benefits everybody in the economy. So the House will pass it, the Senate will pass it, and Andrew Jackson will have to sign it as president. And he'll have to sign it for two reasons. Number one, not signing it would kill the bank and would hurt the economy. And he doesn't want to do that. It will also be unpopular. There's no way Andrew Jackson would get reelected if he vetoed the bank bill. The second reason that Jackson would never veto it is that no president had ever vetoed anything, just about. The presidential veto, the ability of a president to strike down a law that is passed by Congress, was one of the most controversial aspects of the Constitution. And presidents, when they entered office, promised not to use it. It seemed too monarchical, giving too much power to one person, to the executive. There were some very small technical bills that were vetoed by prior presidents, but no major piece of legislation had ever been vetoed. Jackson publicly said that he would use it if he believed that Congress was going to pass something blatantly unconstitutional and undemocratic. So you see, this is a cartoon of Andrew Jackson, King Andrew I, and you can see he's holding the scroll, the veto, just to show that he was an absolutist monarch, to his enemies, willing to strike down what Congress votes in, but just with his stroke of a pen. Clay and Biddle managed to get a very strong bank bill passed in the House and the Senate. The Senate passed it handily on July 4th, 1832. And Nicholas Biddle truly rented out a house near the White House to throw the celebration party. And on the 4th of July, Andrew Jackson could hear the cheers coming from the party in the House. You can imagine Andrew Jackson alone in the White House with his only pal, Martin Van Buren. And Jackson said this, according to Van Buren, this is what Jackson said: "The bank, Mr. Van Buren, is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." And that night, July 4th, 1832, he brought together his kitchen cabinet, his unofficial advisors, and they got to work over the next 6 days on Andrew Jackson's veto message. The veto message he was going to deliver to Congress with the unsigned bill handed back to Congress, the first time it had happened. They worked day and night to write this thing. It's a remarkable piece of political writing. It really is. I read it again in preparation for this talk. Have I mentioned before that I direct the Veterans Breakfast Club, and we have breakfast, but we only have started having them, yesterday was our first one. We take off the cold winter months, which means I spend a lot of time at home by myself. And my wife is a teacher, teaches 8th grade. So she comes home, she's pretty exhausted, and she's done with people coming up to her and wanting to tell her things. That makes for a bad marriage. She comes home, I walk up to her, and she says, "How was your day?" And I said, "I read Andrew Jackson's veto of the bank bill. Wow, is that a powerful piece of writing?" And she slowly backed up. It was very funny. But I was able to get her attention then later in the evening, and I said, "Listen, this is such," and I read pieces of it to her, because I was so struck. I really was. And here's what I'm struck by. There has never, up to this time, there was never any political writing anything like this. This introduced a whole new political grammar into our language, a whole new set of ideas that we had never had before, a whole new populist rhetoric that we had never had before, a whole new set of declarations about what government is for, who it's for. The divisions, the fundamental divisions that government should try to heal, the classes of citizens that government should help. This is the first time that occupations are named, that there's a war between rich and poor. This is a very radical document, is what I'm saying. And it had just a shattering impact on the political culture at the time. This was very widely read, and it was read aloud throughout the country. People were stunned by this. And what I said to my wife is, let me read to you some passages, because I hesitate to put a slide up here with a bunch of words, because I know that could put you to sleep. But I asked her, are these words worthy of putting up on the screen? And Stephanie Ross, my wife, said yes. So if you don't like it, blame her. Here is an excerpt. I just find this so striking because, again, there's nothing like it. No president had ever said anything remotely like this. Nicholas Biddle has told us that most of the state banks exist by the national bank's forbearance. Should its influence become concentrated in the hands of a self-elected directory whose interests are identified with those of the foreign stockholders, will there not be cause to tremble for the purity of our elections in peace and for the independence of our country in war? Controlling our currency, receiving our public monies, and holding thousands of our citizens in dependence, the bank would be more formidable and dangerous than naval and military powers. It will make the American people debtors to aliens. If we cannot at once make our government what it ought to be, we can at least take a stand against any prostitution of our government to the advancement of the few at the expense of the many. That, you could almost picture this guy saying that. And that's, I've stressed the analogies on the one hand between Andrew Jackson and Donald Trump, but I think you could make the analogy certainly with any outsider candidate, no matter where they are on the political spectrum. They all owe a debt to Andrew Jackson, our first outsider, our first populist, our first one kind of, willing to wage war against the powers that be. The most quoted part of the veto message is this, and it's a beautiful piece of political writing. It is to be regretted that the rich and powerful too often bend the acts of government to their selfish purposes. Distinctions in society will always exist under every just government. But when the laws undertake to create artificial distinctions, to grant titles, gratuities, and exclusive privileges, to make the rich richer and the potent more powerful, the humble members of society, the farmers, mechanics, and laborers, who have neither the time nor the means of securing like favors to themselves, have a right to complain of the injustice of their government. If government would confine itself to equal protection, and, as heaven does its rains, shower its favors alike on the high and the low, the rich and the poor, it would be an unqualified blessing. What a beautiful statement. I think. And you could absolutely quibble about the context and even about some of the details in there. But it's a very powerful statement, I think, of where Jackson stood. And it's an extremely powerful statement that government has a responsibility not to exploit fellow citizens, not to favor one class of citizens over another. There had never been anything like this at all in our American political discourse, and when about a third of the country read it, they thought it was the ravings of a lunatic. And Nicholas Biddle said to Henry Clay, "The president must pay the penalty of his own rashness." This is after reading the veto message. "As to the veto message, I'm delighted with it. It has all the fury of a chained panther biting the bars of its cage. It is really a manifesto of anarchy, such as Marat or Robespierre might have issued to the mob. And my hope is that it will contribute to relieve the country from the dominion of these miserable people. You, Henry Clay, are destined to be the instrument of that deliverance." Clay was so confident that the veto message would be so unpopular that he had 20,000 copies of it printed and distributed at his own campaign rallies. He helped to spread the word of the veto message. And man, did he miscalculate. He got trounced in the election. Jackson swept these states in yellow. Clay was lucky to win Kentucky and his own native state. Nicholas Biddle responded then by deciding that the only hope for the bank was to get the houses of Congress to override the presidential veto by a 2/3 majority. They tried to do it and they couldn't. So Biddle hatched a plot. What if we created a Great Depression? What if we created an economic crisis? That way Congress would be forced to override the veto. So Biddle started, you know how the Bank of the United States collected banknotes from banks around the country? They started demanding that these small banks give them the gold coins. And banks started collapsing across the country. As Biddle was in the process of doing this, Andrew Jackson one-upped him. It's amazing that he did it. Andrew Jackson declared through executive order, something else that had rarely ever been done, that the United States would withdraw all its funds from the Second Bank of the United States. And he did. That left the bank with almost nothing. He distributed federal funds to 89 small banks in the West. His people. These are small ma and pa banks. 89, his pet banks, they were called. This was it. He was destroying, this is a cartoon where he's withdrawing, ordered for the removal of public money from the Bank of the United States. And this is a cartoon of the Bank of the United States collapsing. And this guy says something I don't understand. Old Nick is running like a Weatherfield hog with an onion in its mouth. What does that mean? I guess he's running fast. So imagine all government funds going from this big sturdy bank to 89 little banks. The 89 little banks threw a party. And what they did is they lent millions of dollars out to ordinary Americans to buy public land. You know, there was all this public land available in the West that was unsettled. It was a speculative mania. Most of U.S. wealth was in the land to the West. And so Americans, this blue line represents public land sales over time between 1800 and 1842. You can see how it shoots up here. Public land sales. There was a bubble. Prices rose. There was a speculative bubble, just like, you know, any other kind, just like the speculative mortgage bubble in 2007, 2008. And the bubble grew so big that Andrew Jackson, again, with just before he was about to retire from the White House, again issued an executive order, this time requiring that all public land could only be sold with coinage, minted specie. This is called the specie circular, minted coins. So all at once, all the people with these banknotes rushed back to their banks to get the specie, and the banks collapsed. The nation entered the worst depression in its history. It was called the Panic of 1837. By this time, Jackson was out of office. His hand-picked successor, Martin Van Buren, presided over the worst economy in our history. He became known as Martin Van Ruin. And he would be defeated by a Whig candidate, President William Henry Harrison, because of the collapse of the U.S. economy. This represented, in many ways, the end of the age of Jackson, the end of Jacksonianism. Jackson had brought down the economy, through his own actions. Meanwhile, Nicholas Biddle broke the law, ended up in debtor's prison, and died young.
What? Debtor's prison?
Debtor's prison. He did some time in prison he did some very shady deals to try and resurrect the Second Bank of the United States as a Pennsylvania bank, and I think broke some laws, ended up in prison, then ended up very deep in debt that he couldn't pay off, and went to prison a second time. And I think he might have died in debtor's prison, or he died shortly after being released from it. He didn't live very long after this. But this whole episode, Jackson's veto message, the real lasting impact of this whole episode is the veto message. It's not so much what happened with the bank or happened with the economy. It's the language, the grammar, the rhetoric that Andrew Jackson introduced into our political culture that we will hear this year during this election. Get on both sides. It's a shared common language. It's a language that was handed down into the 20th century and continues to the 21st century. Franklin Roosevelt, who really has very little in common with Andrew Jackson, really saw, and Arthur Schlesinger wrote this book, The Age of Jackson, arguing that Franklin Roosevelt was the 20th century version of Andrew Jackson. And Roosevelt always said that he was bringing the spirit of Andrew Jackson into the White House. You can't imagine a less Jacksonian person than Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt said on Jackson Day dinner, 1936, the real truth of the matter is, as you and I know, that a financial element in the large centers has owned the government of the U.S. since the days of Andrew Jackson. They remember the veto message as this great moment. And here's somebody at the other end of the political spectrum, President Ronald Reagan, also extolling Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was a president who cared about the average American. The first United States president to be born in a log cabin, Jackson spoke for the average citizen and fought the vested interests. It was Jackson who reminded us that one man with courage makes a majority. Throughout his stormy life, he lived by that motto, defending his honor, our union, and the inalienable rights of every American citizen, regardless of station. He said that at the Hermitage. Beautiful words, I think. It really absolutely captures the spirit of Andrew Jackson. So we live with this grammar, we live with this rhetoric, we live with Andrew Jackson whether we like it or not, and we'll be encountering his ghost on this year's election campaign. Next month I will be back and I will finally put Andrew Jackson to bed with the story of his role in the Trail of Tears. I'll see you then.